Many talks begin by referencing what has become known as the 3 billion birds paper. Some of you have probably seen this published in 2019. And I'll do the same here because it's such a splashy headline and a call to action. It's estimated that we have about 3 billion fewer birds in North America than we did in 1970, a decline of about 30%. And looking specifically at migratory birds, that is a loss of 2.5 billion individuals or 28% decline. And looking at eastern forest birds, a decline of 17%. Wood thrush falls into those two categories and is, in fact, the bird called out here in this figure specifically was 6 in 10 gone, estimated since 1970. We see this trend at a local scale as well. For example, if we look at our breeding bird atlas, which some of you may have helped to complete back in 2011 or so, this map on the left shows changes in breeding distribution or where breeding wood thrush can be found in the state. And they're still found breeding more or less statewide when compared to the late 70s, apart from maybe some losses in southeastern Mass and the Cape and Islands. As indicated by those downward pointing red arrows. But looking at breeding bird survey data on the right, which provides an estimate of abundance, there are far fewer birds out there. So still found through much of the state, but in fewer numbers. And looking at more recent data from 2012 through 2022, trend also reflected in the eBird status and trends platform, with large declines in Massachusetts and the surrounding area. So while eBird is certainly a fun way to record and share observations, there's also some really great conservation tools being produced. So if you do use eBird, I encourage you to keep it up. These declines have caused wood thrush to be classified as, for example, a tipping point species by the Road to Recovery, which is an initiative that rose out of that 3 billion birds paper. Other assessments include terms like highly vulnerable, priority migrant species, right, listed as threatened in Canada, and a species of greatest conservation need in Massachusetts. So before I move forward, I'd like to put forth a few quotes or concepts that I think about all the time at work, and which I think can help tie everything I'll present together. The first is that, with a few exceptions, wildlife management is really people management, as I've been told many times by my wildlife professors over the years. As conservationists, we're trying to get people to stop doing one thing, start doing another, correcting for our actions in the past, or trying to anticipate future human needs, human-induced threats to nature, right? The second is a quote from Aldo Leopold, as written in the Sand County Almanac, which is a foundational book of wildlife conservation and still very relevant today. And he wrote, there are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace. That's not to say that everyone needs to own a farm or heat their homes with wood, but we all do need to remember that we are inextricably linked and reliant on the natural world, right, and the resources it does provide. And it's that cognitive decoupling, if you will, of humans from nature that sort of got us into this trouble. But we are indeed part of the greater system. And then there's the idea of fortress conservation. That is the approach or philosophy of establishing large reserves that are largely off limits to people, except possibly for recreation or some other more non-consumptive uses. Now, let me be clear, establishing such protected areas is certainly an important conservation tool. But that approach alone falls short in several ways. Removing people from the land means limiting their access to natural resources, and this often unfolds in inequitable ways. And also, protected areas can realistically only cover a limited amount of land and can fail to adequately represent regional biodiversity, especially in highly biodiverse areas like the tropics. So there's a need and a call to figure out ways to sustain biodiversity in agricultural areas, right? I heard mentioned, I believe in your minutes, people adding hedgerows to fields and things to support birds that are providing these ecosystem services via pest control and whatnot. Um, so, accommodating birds in areas that are not necessarily protected, but maybe agricultural or other areas that are often termed working lands under different types of ownerships or control. And finally, a quote from Henry David Thoreau: "The thrush alone declares the immortal wealth and vigor that is in the forest." Um, I put forth that a forest which sustains wood thrush is a healthy, functional, and resilient system. This is certainly true during the breeding season, and to be determined during the wintering season, as I'll discuss. So what's going on with thrush? What are its threats and habitat needs? Well, being a widely distributed migratory species that can vary through time and space. This figure, maybe you all have seen this, also derived from eBird data. It shows weekly abundance of wood thrush. And in January, they're heavily concentrated in southern Mexico and northern Central America. But then as spring migration gets underway in mid-April, they're heading up into northeastern US, southern Canada there. And then eventually back down to the wintering grounds. We can do that again because I just think it's so cool. Up they go. They're breeding. Post-breeding season, and then back down on migration to the wintering area. So this annual cycle can be separated into 5 distinct parts: the breeding season, the post-fledgling season, fall migration. We'll use the term wintering season today, and then spring migration. Understanding the habitat needs and threats of wood thrush and what they face during each of these periods is important, right? You can do everything possible to conserve a species, for example, during the breeding season, but if things aren't going well elsewhere or during other phases, well, you'll need to address that as well, or instead. And this is exactly what is meant by full annual cycle conservation, considering each of these somewhat distinct parts. Beginning with the breeding season, right? We know what some males may arrive in spring a few days ahead of the females. They secure territory. The females do most of the nest building. They often are double brooded. The nest is 2 to 5 meters high, made with this material and that type of tree, etc. So, in other words, well, it's wrong direction. We know a lot about wood thrush during the breeding season. And this is true for a lot of migratory birds. Here's a small sample of the available papers. So get reading. I'm joking. You don't have to read. While there is always more to learn, much of this information has been synthesized into guides for practitioners, and we have management practices and conservation programs underpinned by a whole bunch of science. But just to sum it up, one thing with brush need is, well, large areas of forest, contiguous tracts of forest. They can successfully reproduce in smaller patches, especially if there's a lot of forest in the surrounding landscape, right? So forest loss and fragmentation can be certainly a driver of declines during the breeding season. And then once they have that area of forest, they need the places to nest, to forage, to hide from predators. And apologies for this lower quality image, but this is from a Pin the Bird to the Habitat feature exhibit that we designed. That's popular among school-age kids. And it's showing habitat features of high-quality forest bird habitat. So developed layers of vegetation in parts of the understory, mid-story, gaps in the canopy, right, letting light down to the forest floor, creating that flush of growth, cavity trees, logs on the ground, this sort of structural complexity as we term it. And so the wood thrush is right here, just showing that it needs a bit of mid-story where it'll nest. Large trees, a variety of deciduous tree species, right? All these features that, this is simplifying it, but due to past and some current land use choices, many of these features can be lacking in the forests of Massachusetts, but they can be created with forestry, particularly on these working lands that I described, right? The areas outside of protected areas. And doing so can help, these sort of actions can help to increase the resilience of our forests to climate change and other stresses as well. So Mass Audubon has a goal on our current action agenda to protect and steward resilient landscapes. Our land protection team is doing great work here, not only striving to protect 30% of Massachusetts by 2026, but doing so in a manner that creates large contiguous tracts of forest. And for that, the wood thrush, I'm speaking for them if I can, are thankful. We're also striving to enhance the management of 200,000 acres of private forest land. So our programs such as Foresters for the Birds and our Climate Smart Forestry program, they train practitioners, consulting foresters to conduct outreach to landowners, right? Reminding them of the role they could potentially play in forest bird conservation, connecting them to the land if needed, and to assist them in enhancing the management of forests for habitat and climate resiliency, among other goals. And so, as framed in this agenda, resilient landscapes are large, connected landscapes that provide healthy, diverse habitats, migratory corridors for wildlife, clean air, clean water, recreation, adaptation to climate change for wildlife and people, right? So what I'm saying here is that creating resilient landscapes is good for wood thrush, and what is good for wood thrush creates these resilient landscapes. Moving on to the post-fledgling fledging period. This is the period when the fledglings have left the nest, but before everybody embarks on fall migration. It's a somewhat newer area of study, and some interesting things are happening. So generally speaking, right, there are birds that breed within older, more mature forests, and those that breed in young forests or other scrubby, early successional habitats. And by the way, that group of young forest birds is a group that has experienced some steep declines as well, largely driven by loss of this breeding habitat. But after breeding, some mature forest birds during this post-fledgling period, like the wood thrush and scarlet tanager, are moving into this young forest habitat. And it's thought this is because the denser cover provides protection from predators, or because these areas are full of insects and in particular fruit during this time of year, which is a valuable resource while molting and just before departing on migration. What's more, the golden-winged warbler, an early successional breeder, has been found to be moving into mature forest during this time. Now, we no longer have golden wings in Massachusetts, but maybe other birds are moving in this direction as well. It's a fruitful area of research right now. But considering the importance of having different ages of forest in close proximity to each other, there's a trend of moving towards a landscape level planning approach, right, to coordinate who is doing what type of work, where and when, better support forest birds. So instead of doing what could be considered random acts of management on the landscape, you can coordinate your efforts, put things in closer proximity to each other, which increases that conservation impact of what you're doing, while intentionally perhaps leaving other areas untouched, letting natural processes play out, sequestering and storing a lot of carbon, right? And this is an approach we're actively working on. Now, technically, next comes fall migration, but we'll skip ahead to the wintering period for now, which again is the longest period within the annual cycle. And as is true for most, if not all, migratory birds, this is a drastically understudied period, despite evidence indicating that conditions on the wintering grounds could really be driving declines. And so for wood thrush, we know there are basic habitat associations. They can be found in primary forest, secondary forest, agroforestry systems. We know a bit about where they're more abundant and different rates of survival. Interestingly, there are species that sometimes occurs at high densities, like really packing into areas where they have low survival. So for example, one study found that the more time wood thrush this study here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, spent the more time wood thrush are spending in heavily shaded coffee plantations, the less likely they are to survive and get eaten by predators. So it's important again to consider metrics besides abundance, but things like survival. One thing that is missing are studies examining a range of habitat conditions or wood thrush response to forest management practices on the wintering grounds. And this is the same sort of studies that, again, underpin guidelines and conservation programs on the breeding grounds, as I described. So meanwhile, there's a call, again, and this time in the wintering grounds, to identify land use practices that sustain biodiversity, but also provide some level of economic activity for the growing economies of some countries in South America where these birds are headed, or migratory birds in general, I should say. What is termed low impact sustainable logging may fit the bill as one of these land use practices. It can be practiced over large areas, and unlike many agroforestry systems like coffee, it maintains native vegetation to a large extent. And there's evidence that this lower impact logging is relatively benign to biodiversity, but studies to date have largely looked at logged versus unlogged areas and not that range of conditions. And they have looked only at species richness, or like how many species are in the system, or abundance, and not performance-based metrics. I keep mentioning survival. And they haven't looked specifically at migratory birds. So to begin filling this gap in 2023, Mass Audubon and partners received a grant from the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act, as administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We titled it Forestry Standards for Wintering Migratory Birds. The study site is in Belize, and our main partner is an organization called Program for Belize. And so I hope you can see my pointer. Belize is here, bordering Guatemala to the west, southwest, Mexico to the north. And Program for Belize owns and manages the Rio Bravo Conservation and Management Area, shown in red on the right. That's 250,000 acres of land, which is almost about 4% of the size of Massachusetts. So it's a huge area. This chunk of land here was protected about 5 or 6 years ago by another organization who holds it now. So it's a large forest, and connecting into Guatemala and Mexico as part of the Selva Maya forest, one of the largest contiguous tracts in Central America remaining, if not the largest. And all of that land is forested and protected from being cleared, which is important because deforestation is a big driver of declines, right? On the top is a photo I took while driving along the border of Rio Bravo, and the bottom photo being satellite imagery along that same part of the road. So the right side of the photos was forested as recently as 7 or 8 years ago. So it's a real and ongoing threat. PF Program for Belize, PFB, you might hear me call them for short, manages Rio Bravo under an agreement with the government for biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. So to that end, they run a sustainable timber program on about a third of this land, as shown in yellow. Only about a third of that area, or a sixth of the total, has been harvested in recent decades under their program. And it's largely driven by the economic value of mahogany. And much of that is exported, but does provide some economic productivity for Belize. And about 12 other species are also harvested, which is an important natural resource used domestically. And the program does provide a bunch of jobs locally as well. And the timber program is sustainable in the sense that they don't harvest everything they can sell, but instead retain things like seed trees, so trees that provide a future seed source, these old legacy trees, future crop trees for harvesting. All these things are retained and following this sort of well, a sustainable yield model is what it's called. But the impact on biodiversity certainly needs to be better investigated. And so they know the location of every tree that has been harvested, as represented by these small yellowish dots on the right. Every tree that's been harvested, when it happened, what species, all this great information within these 250, the square 250 acre compartment, as it's called. So they're harvesting 3 or 4 of those a year they strive for. And then the darker shaded areas over here are a representation or areas with higher density of trees removed per acre. And the lighter areas being, almost no trees removed. So it sets up this gradient of harvest intensity, as we're calling it, and a sort of natural experiment that's unfolding over time. And again, it's not highly intense logging like massive clear cuts or anything. A tree is plucked out of the forest here and there, and with little disruption, but allowing enough light to the forest floor, right? Similar to what I said on the breeding grounds, to create some of this dense growth. The exact conditions wood thrush and maybe other birds might actually prefer. And so there's a stump here, and here's a picture of Dave King, my academic advisor from the U.S. Forest Service and faculty at UMass, who I was able to rope into the project. Didn't have much trouble, really. And so it's a bit of a dense slide, so apologies, but we're running this constant effort mist netting study, as it's termed, over that gradient of logging intensity, right? So we're doing 20 sites, 10 per year. And basically this means intensively banding birds at each site before moving on to the next, and then banding each site 3 times throughout this season. From this, we can get estimates of species richness, abundance. So by richness, I think I described this, but the number of species present, abundance, age and sex ratios, change in body condition over time, another performance metric, and survival estimates. We are also putting radio tags on wood thrush to track them through the forest to estimate habitat selection, or what habitat features and where they're choosing to be, and what they're using in the forest. And that also allows us to get at survival again and home range sizes. And the radio tags can also be picked up by MODIS stations, which, if you're unfamiliar with them, they're these stationary automated radio telemetry sites, right? That when they can pick up birds when they fly past. So by installing some of these stations around the area, we can ideally get dates of when these birds are departing on spring migration and track them through this network of stations across North America to get migration speed, for example, connectivity data. And I'll talk more about all that later. But all this information can be related back to habitat quality, and provide guidance on management for birds through forestry. The exact sort of management, right, that is underpinning the habitat management work on the breeding grounds. And then our findings could be readily applied through a program for Belize's logging program, disseminated and tested by others throughout the region. And we're gathering this information for all species, not just migratory or resident, right? And not just wood thrush. So we can assess the impacts on all species and make recommendations for the entire community of forest birds. So for fun here, let's see, I believe that was a least flycatcher, red-capped manakin, American redstart, white-whiskered puffbird, gray catbird, ivory-billed wood creeper, white-eyed vireo, royal flycatcher, a wood thrush sporting the radio tag, white-breasted wood wren, blue bunting, yellow-breasted chat, ruddy-tailed flycatcher, magnolia warbler, Kentucky warbler, Wilson's, and hummingbird, all mixed together in these tropical forests. Um, and I'll take this moment just to mention the colonial history of Belize, once called British Honduras, and the fact that they're still surely feeling the effects of this past. Uh, and so we wanted to be sensitive about, parachuting in and telling them how they need to be doing things. And instead, we worked closely with Program for Belize, who we have a decades-long relationship with, to co-develop this project, ensure that our expertise was indeed invited and needed, and to take opportunities to then build that expertise and capacity within the country. So this top left here is Miss Abidas Ash from the University of Belize. She's a top banner in the country who now, we were able to train her on how to put these radio tags on birds. She also helped to provide some oversight and guidance to our two young Belizean field technicians who also gained some great experience with banding and telemetry during the project, and other pictures showing Program for Belize staff getting trained in activating radio tags and just general discussion about the project, and some guys in the field there in the forest, me and two staff members from Program for Belize. And the project is sponsoring a couple of bird identification and banding workshops, right? Open to guides, open to anybody, but targeted towards guides, like birding guides and rangers and folks looking to get into field technician and ornithology sort of work. And excuse me, one of our Modus towers went up at a local school, the St. Michael Roman Catholic School, which is a great educational opportunity. These kids can see the recorded data and which birds have flown by their school. And thanks to the donation of some optics, including from folks at Allen Bird Club, Program for Belize has started the St. Michael's Environment and Bird Club. So thank you for that generosity. This initiative has included a few trips to their school to give presentations and to install, here we are installing the radio antennas that are picking up the birds flying by. And some trips out to the field station to see the forest and the birds and a banding site in action. Just a few more pictures here, including drawing of birds in the classroom and labeling the field marks and body parts and whatnot. And then when we went down to kick off the second field season back in November, so we're on our second year right now, our intern Abby Garcia came down and presented at the school and had the kids participate in a sort of migration obstacle course. So a lot of fun stuff going on there. And this is all a great way to connect these kids, again, making those connections to the natural world. Their school is in the town of San Felipe, so up here in the north, which is essentially surrounded by agricultural land. They're only about an hour's drive or so from the study site here at Hillbank Field Station, but it would remain pretty inaccessible to them if it weren't for the outreach that Program for Belize has initiated. Meanwhile, there is a bit of illegal logging and poaching of wildlife that occurs in the protected area. And some of those people that are doing that do live in the town of San Felipe. And so demonstrating the value of this forest for reasons other than illegal logging and poaching is an important mission of Program for Belize. It's said that one of the best ways to reach people is through their kids. Right? So wildlife management is people management in many cases. Okay, so starting to wrap up here, the migratory periods, spring and fall, and knowing the routes of migratory birds, what routes they're taking and where they stop along the way can help to guide actions to reduce threats, right? And to ensure that birds have habitat and the resources they need to refuel, essentially, when in transit. And while we're still learning more, there is some evidence that wood thrush are migrating along a similar route to other species. That is, in the fall, they're funneling down through the tip of Florida, resting and refueling for a few days, and then crossing the Gulf of Mexico in a single night. And then in the spring, they move up through the Yucatan Peninsula before, again, crossing the Gulf and landing on the Texas-Louisiana coast. So yeah, ensuring that good habitat is in place along these migratory routes is definitely key. It's also important to test for migratory connectivity. That is, do birds from specific areas of the breeding grounds all go to specific places in the winter? So an example of strong migratory connectivity, or do they mix it up? More a weaker connectivity or non-existent? And then do those populations experience different threats during different parts of the annual cycle, thus requiring a different approach to their conservation? This is all things that are actively being worked on to sort of guide our actions across this annual cycle. Wood thrush seem to have a moderate level of connectivity. So birds breeding in the Northeast, tending to winter in Costa Rica and Panama. Those we'll call the Midwestish or Lake states, heading to Honduras, Nicaragua, and those kind of in the Southeast heading to Belize, Guatemala, southern Mexico. But this information on migratory routes and this connectivity is based on just one or two studies, and it's certainly important to confirm this and perhaps using different tracking technologies. So, for example, as I've already mentioned a bit, using radio tags and the network of MODIS stations. So these yellow dots are representing MODIS stations. Again, automated radio telemetry stations which log data. It can typically pick up any tagged bird flying within 10 miles or so. And so I mentioned we put up 3 stations around the study area at Hillbank Field Station down here, at the school, St. Michael's School here, and then at La Milpa, which is another La Milpa Eco Lodge, another program for Belize facility. And then somebody else's tower over here, which would also pick up our birds. And so any bird leaving the study area on migration has a pretty good chance of flying through these detection lobes, as they're called, and then up through this network of stations in North America. Oh, and if you're curious, a common way to attach these radio tags is by fashioning like a backpack that the bird wears over its wings, constructed with jewelry making cord and super glue. So a low-tech solution for attaching this high-tech device, but it works. And here is what the data look like on a map. So this is showing birds detected by our receiver at Hillbank Field Station, with thrushes shown by those golden yellow lines. A lot of Swainson's thrush, and with that greenish teal color. A rose-breasted grosbeak tagged in Colombia, heading through Central America. Summer tanager, gray catbird, morning warbler. It's always kind of a treat to download the data and see, fingers crossed, all the cool stuff you picked up. And a bunch of these wood thrush tracks are from a range-wide tagging project going on, with hundreds of tags being deployed across the United States and in countries in the wintering grounds, including here in Massachusetts by our state ornithologist, Drew Vitz, and including at a few Mass Audubon sanctuaries. So Ipswich River, Drumlin Farm, and Wachusett Meadow in Princeton would be closest to your club there. And in fact, some of those birds have been picked up at our site in Belize, which is just really neat. And a lot of great information should be gained through this larger initiative. And then finally, I'll pull out just this one wood thrush and show you this sort of connect the dots illustration of where it went. And so a little bit of patience that should pop up. It was tagged in Costa Rica, up through Belize, up now during the summertime breeding, out of the range of any tower, and then eventually with fall migration, headed south where it was last picked up, I believe at our tower in Belize. And this is a fun bird in particular to highlight because when our intern Abby, who I told you about, was preparing to present to the kids at St. Michael's School in Belize, she obtained some resources from an organization that was working with school kids in Pennsylvania. And those kids noticed by looking at the MODIS website that this bird had flown by their school and also by St. Michael's School in Belize. And they're now planning on interacting in some way, meeting virtually, maybe pen pals. I'm not sure. It's we'll see. It's a really recent development, but just really cool. And here we are connecting landscapes and people across thousands of miles through our shared migratory birds. And that's what it's all about. And so I'll just thank you for joining me on this full annual cycle journey. I realize I threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully it was enjoyable and I can take some questions if we have time. Thanks all.
Thank you, Jeff, for that great presentation. We have a few questions here. First of all, from Andrea. Why is the bird's migratory route different in the fall than it is in the spring?
Huh. Well, first, would it be helpful? Should I stop screen sharing or maybe keep the slides up? I'll keep them up for now unless I hear otherwise. That's a really great question. And maybe I need to read up on that. They do, I mean, I don't know. Fall migration tends to be a slower, more relaxed drift further south. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. And then maybe in the spring, they're taking a more risky route by going up through Yucatan in a rush to get to the breeding grounds. It tends to be a faster migration, but I'll have to get back to you on that one.
All right. Next question from Janice Zepko. With forested areas growing throughout the last century in Massachusetts, why is the wood thrush in such trouble here?
Yeah, in part that could be due to forest fragmentation and loss of forest in general. And then the fragmentation part is, if they need relatively large patches of habitat to breed in, especially if there's not a lot of forest in the landscape. And then some of those habitat features I described, I kind of glossed over it, but it has a bit to do with our land use history where most of our forests, essentially all of them in Massachusetts, were once totally cleared for agricultural practices and sort of during the colonial times, and folks headed to the cities for different sorts of work or to the Midwest and abandoning a bunch of this agricultural land. It all kind of grew up at the same time. So it's all around 100, 120 years old or so. And it kind of, because of that, lacks structural complexity that would have been found in these older growth forests, right? The big trees, the gaps in the canopy, the flush of growth that happens when a tree falls. And so basically recommendations are to emulate some of that through forestry practices on some land to enhance the habitat for wood thrush and other birds. I hope that answered the question.
All right, we have another question too. This is from Tom and Robbie. And the question is, are there federal dollars involved in the research?
There are, and it's we have the money in the bank, so it's not a reimbursed grant if that's where the question is implying. So the project itself isn't at risk, but future funding certainly is.
And Jeff, I have a question myself.
Yeah,
Earlier in the presentation, you showed an image of how the golden wing warbler
right.
is using more mature forests.
Yeah.
Was that for breeding or for migration?
So that's the period in between this sort of post-fledging period where a
Uh,
lot of the mature birds are going to young forests, and then apparently at least one young forest bird, early successional breeders, is going to mature forest before migrating. So they have this sort of shift in habitat use, requiring us to think about all phases of this annual cycle, including that short little couple weeks or a month or so post-breeding.
so, do you think then there would be a chance for uh, the golden wing warbler to make more appearances in our state because of all the mature forest we have?
The mature forest piece, so the point I was trying to make is that they kind of have to be in pretty close proximity to each other. So you need this sort of mosaic on the landscape of
Yeah.
mature forest and then like off the top of my head for golden wing, I don't know, 5 acres or more of young forest, this regenerating conditions. So they're breeding the young forest and then traveling, less than a kilometer to the mature forest. And so we have a lot of that in the state, but not necessarily this young forest. We have some, and if golden wings are to recolonize the state, it would be at higher elevations in the Berkshires, Western Mass. Um,
Mhm.
and perhaps if they start shifting northwards in response to climate change, it'd be great to have the habitat in place. And I think we do, but um, below target levels, I would say.
All right. Thank you for that, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any more questions out there? Do, 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 do. Oh.
Oh, I see one in the chat there.
Oh, yeah, there's one there too from Eileen Goldstein. Modus towers, cost of towers, number of antennas.
Yeah, this is it's highly variable in that you have folks that are like building their own receivers from, I don't know if people heard of Raspberry Pis, if you're like in the computer science world, it's like the small mini computer of sorts. And like you can build your own antennas and really kind of go at it in an improvised way, which would be much cheaper. Or you can buy the antennas, you can buy the receivers. They're more proprietary, but often tend to be more reliable. But and we were able to have used receivers from different projects. But if you're going all out with the receiver, I don't know, 8 grand. The antennas, the ones we had are three antennas, and they're about 10 feet long and new. They probably cost $600 a piece. Coax cable, solar panels is what we're using, or rather a marine deep cycle battery to store the energy. There's all sorts of ways to set it up with varying costs, but all in, I don't know. And then you could add different types of antennas with like different number of elements sticking out of the side, which affects detection distance and sort of shape of that detection lobe. So anywhere from 3 to, I don't know, 7 antenna you can have on a tower.
Okay. Another question from Tom and Robbie. Do you have links to how to use Raspberry Pi?
No, I mean they certainly exist if you mean in the context of like setting up a modus station. They're probably out there, and there's a great community. This is all just like folks working naturally together under this. I mean, Birds Canada is the folks who implement the platform modus, but it's just like anyone can set up a tower, register it with a network, and we're all sharing data. So it's a very collaborative, sort of unorganized but organized, if you will, group of folks. So, and there's like a list serve. You can ask questions like, anybody have resources on how to use Raspberry Pi to set up a telemetry receiver station?
And Audrey Werner has a comment, and she says, this project is a wonderful example of collaboration with Belize institutions. I loved hearing about the schools getting involved. Congratulations on the effort.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been I mean, I'm coming at it from like a cold-hearted scientist sort of as my background training, but as I mentioned, it's important to get people involved, right? Ultimately, it's changing the behavior of people, and school groups are a great way to do that. So that's been a fun little project or element of the larger project. And it's not just, I mean, they're starting to go to other communities as well and engaging with other kids. So it's been really cool.
All righty. Okay, so now I'm getting a comment that there is a Raspberry Pi link,
Yeah.
and yeah, a link on a Modus Tower information too. So
Yeah.
these are all good things.
Yeah.
Um,
That's how it works, is sharing. I mean, it's a slippery slope and sharing information and the things I
yep.
never thought I'd have to learn to do this.
Yep. No, this is all very good. Any more questions for Jeff from anyone?
You know how to find me. So if you want to pass
Oh,
it
oh,
along,
we do. We do.
happy to answer any later on as well.
Okay.
Jeff, thank you for a wonderful talk. I loved hearing about the international connection between humans and landscapes and birds and animals. It was fabulous.
Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, you're getting lots of thanks and kudos in the chat. But I'm going to say, be well and bird often, Ellen Bird Club. Thank you for coming tonight, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you,
Okay.
Andrea
Decided
and
not to.
Vince.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Is that it?